Hello, I'm Ronald D. executive producer and co-creator of For All Mankind, welcoming you to our virtual panels. And I'll be joined today by my co-creators and executive producers, Matt Wolpert and Ben Nedivi, as well as several members of our cast. And at the end of it all, we're going to show you an exclusive sneak peek of season 2. So sit back, relax, and enjoy For All Mankind.
Ladies, take your seats. We'll get this show on the road. I'm head of the astronaut office, and I'm here to welcome you to NASA. This is a rigorous 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week training program preparing you for space travel.
You are too busy joking around in there to see what's going on. He doesn't trust you, because the truth is, you're not good enough, Molly. Not right now. And you're gonna be the first American woman in space. You have to be perfect.
I'm not trying to be some role model for women. I'm just a pilot.
No, you're an astronaut.
You come from near and far and all across America. I know you've waited for this day for a long time. Congratulations, you are officially astronaut candidates.
I'm going to the moon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Wolpert. I'm one of the creators and executive producers of For All Mankind, and I'm moderating this discussion with some of our cast. And I'll start out with some introductions. We have Wrenn Schmidt, who plays Margot Madison. We have Sarah Jones, who plays Tracy Stevens. We have Jodi Balfour, who plays Ellen Waverly, then Ellen Wilson. We have Krys Marshall, who plays Danielle Poole. And we have Sonya Walger, who plays Molly Cobb. And I guess my first question for you guys is, and this is for all of you, seeing my own daughter look at the world and sort of how important representation is to her in seeing like what is possible for her and not possible. What do you guys think might have been some changes to our world now if our alternate history of our show were real history and women had been a part of the space program from the beginning? Maybe we'll start with Wrenn.
I think when you lock out 50% of your population from bringing all of their talents and intelligence to, the things that they love best, you really lose out by not having those resources. And when women in general are in positions of power, they tend to bring people in. That doesn't mean that they don't have blind spots. I feel like they tend to distribute resources differently. They tend to address problems differently. And I feel like any program that's more inclusive is better. I feel like that's a little oversimplified. But plus, women are awesome.
Well, I think we've been conditioned that way as well as women. I think society has also conditioned us to hold that space for many voices to sort of be able to hear everyone. But we don't have to get into that of why we've been conditioned that way. But yeah, to piggyback on what you're saying, Wrenn, I agree.
I think so often as women, there is sort of the inherent competition of like, how can a woman be better than a man? How can she prove herself in comparison to a man? And I think, in my opinion, the more ideal way to see it is like, how can women in our existence be in addition to what men are doing and what they're bringing rather than be in competition? I think about baseball, right? Like having Jackie Robinson be the first Black Major League Baseball player, it didn't need for him to be better than other players. I mean, it was a benefit that he was an amazing baseball player, but his addition to the league brought intrigue, brought diversity, brought fans. And as we saw during that, earlier, women playing baseball because the men were off at war, it continues to just show us that like women don't have to be pitted against men in order to have a place in society. We can just be there in addition to and be allowed to contribute and just trust that that contribution will be worthwhile.
Yeah. And to your question, Matt, I think what may have been the inevitable consequences to seeing women in the workplace, particularly a workplace like NASA, as early as the 60s, let's say, we would have had the opportunity to see the kinds of things that Sarah, Wrenn, and Krys are talking about modeled for the rest of society, both not just representation to see women in those positions, creating a pathway for young girls and women to see what's possible, but also to model the fact that we don't have to, there doesn't have to be an intrinsic power dynamic at play between men and women, that in fact there's collaboration there and that there are strengths and weaknesses to celebrate that only benefit the environment holistically. And yeah, I think the importance of modeling behavior in society is huge. So it's hard to speculate what the world would look like, but one could certainly suggest that it would be a less conflictual place where gender dynamics are concerned.
Right.
I'm curious because I think it's interesting to know, just to think about the historical perspective. There was a woman in space. She just was Russian, and Valentina went to space. So it's not like that hasn't happened. It did happen. And the arc of history, albeit the fact that she was a Soviet woman, did not change that much. It still took us as a gender an enormous amount of time in order to get any kind of parity. Parity we're still fighting for now. So I'm curious what would have happened in that time in the 60s when women were still very objectified by the media and Playboy and, the kind of movies that were coming out. What would possibly have happened to the pin-up female astronaut who made it to space? Would she have had to be in a bikini in order to get noticed, attention? I don't know.
But I do appreciate, Matt, that there was a call out on how women were portrayed, which happened through Tracy Stevens. Nixon wanting his blonde and wanting his space couple had nothing to do initially with what Tracy could actually offer the program as a pilot. It was about the way she looked. It was about who her husband was. It was like almost everything but what her actual skills were. So I also appreciate that, sort of what Sonya was saying, that was examined and called out, because that would have been likely,
Right. And it wouldn't have felt real if suddenly everything was just different. They even though we changed that one event, the world was still the same world. There was still sexism. It's not like, even with the passage of the ERA, there was still a lot of pushback. To that point, Sarah, one of the things I was thinking about as I was thinking about what I would ask you guys, I noticed that a lot of your characters are sort of forced to play different roles with different people. And I think that's something, especially at that time, women had to do. But I was wondering, Sarah, with Tracy, she has such a huge arc, and the role she's playing in the beginning of that astronaut's wife who's sort of trapped in that version of her life and then becomes, by the end, of this sort of heroic space pilot. Did your perception of Tracy or the way you related to her change over the course of the season? Or how was that to play such a huge sweeping arc for a character?
I don't think so. I think, which, it was something that we had all discussed prior in playing it, that Tracy always had a sort of rebellious spirit and always sort of did the bare minimum of her astro wife duties. It wasn't her scene. It wasn't her crew. And so I think Tracy got a little lost, which was what I appreciated in how that could be applicable to women today. I think sometimes we still get lost sometimes because we're conditioned to care for so many people and hold the space for so many people. And oftentimes we end up neglecting ourselves in the process. She had neglected herself in the process, thinking that that was her duty as a wife, as a mother, that once she was given this opportunity and realized that it was possible to have a career and to take care of herself and put herself in this family equation that she's actually a part of. She's a part of the family too. That I think I think the arc for me was the notion that it wasn't so much about Tracy proving herself as a pilot, proving that she belonged in the program, but it was the exercise and execution of finally saying, I matter, I'm enough, and I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do this because it's what I want to do. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be every bit of the mother and wife that I know I can be.
That's interesting, the idea of putting others first. I feel like Danielle is really the epitome of that, in that she, I mean, that is one of the most heroic moments of season 1, is something that will never be known. I was wondering how you found balancing those two sort of versions of Danielle.
This is one aspect of playing Dani that came to me very easily, because, you know, as a woman, as a Black woman, you sort of learn to engage the world this way. You know, you walk into a room and kind of gauge the temperature of how much of my real self can I bring to this environment? You take a look around the room and see, am I the only Black person here? These are just truths about living the life, you know, living life as me, that no one ever really taught me explicitly. I just, you know, you're just steeped in it. So being Dani is very much akin to being Krys. You know, she is sort of navigating what she can say and when she can't speak up. There was a scene that was I think it was in episode 4 that got pulled out. But there's a moment where, you know, the girls are all standing around and Margot's engaging them about a very complex sort of equation, and no one can answer it. And Dani finally speaks up and she says, you know, actually, not only do I know this very well. And she explains it, you know, quite exquisitely. And so that sort of quieting your personality, muting yourself, and finding, you know, trustworthy sources of who can I be myself with. And I think that Dani sort of early engages with Tracy in that little moment in the classroom when she turns to her and, you know, Tracy introduces herself, and the whole room, who's made Dani feel like an outsider. Now, you know, she sort of found one person who makes her feel like she's on the inside. So that, for me, was not something that, as an actor, I really had to stretch a whole lot to understand what that's like. It just, you know, it comes to you naturally.
It's funny, too, because I think Molly is someone who really has never played a role other than what she is naturally, is who she is. But then as she is chosen as the first woman in space, I love the scene where you're walking down the hallway, Sonya, and it hits Molly for the first time. I'm not just who I've always been. I am also this other thing to all these women. I'm this inspiring figure. And that tension of like, I have to be more than one thing now, was really interesting to see you play. How was that? How was shooting that scene? I mean, was that
I'm tearing just remembering it. It was really, really emotional doing that scene. It was so much more than I thought it would be. It was interesting because the configuration of how we had to be in order to shoot it was that Joel and I were apart at the end of that long corridor in our suits. And we had to sit around in our suits for a long time because orchestrating that steady camera down a long corridor lined with people understandably took an enormous amount of time to light and prep. But it was kind of like a piece of theater because I felt like I was in the wings doing that thing where you keep yourself at a simmer, ready to go on, but you don't know who's in the house, you don't know what kind of a night it's going to be. It felt very, very theatrical in its experience, and to then come through the doors carrying. That was the other thing. I hadn't prepped for how heavy carrying your own oxygen tank was. What we're carrying is our fans that circulate what we would have been carrying our oxygen tanks, but even those fans are damn heavy. So I'm lumbering along and all I'm thinking about is just don't look down the barrel of the lens because you never want to do that. And I've got Joel in front of me. And then there's that moment where Joel's character realizes that it's not about him and he falls back to let Molly step forward. And that was, again, this lovely moment of synchronicity of where I hadn't really taken in what the corridor was because I'm so busy concentrating on the wretched fan and the suit and the sweating and all of that. And then Joel stepped aside and there's all these women. And then there's my beloved women waiting for me at the end who've been rivals and, got mad at Molly, and Molly knows damn well what they all think of her. And yet there they all are in utter solidarity, applauding, beaming at me. I feel emotional even talking about it now. It was such a beautiful, beautiful scene to get to shoot. It really was. It was a piece of pure theater and adrenaline to do.
Wonderful. It was beautiful. One thing I wanted to ask to Jodi, with Ellen, she's such a driven person who accomplishes so much, and yet the more she accomplishes, the more attention she receives, the harder it is for her to live her secret life. And finding a balance of those two things that she wants. How was it to play someone who was the two things she wanted most were so in conflict with each other?
Yeah. How was it to play? The biggest gift, not for her, but for me as the actor. But yeah, just such a fascinating thing to dive into, to simultaneously hold two equal desires in very separate hands and how to navigate that. And I think particularly in season 1, she, the opportunity to become an astronaut sort of came out of nowhere. And I'm not sure up until that point if she'd even, and likely hadn't because there'd been no representation, but whether she'd even considered that as a possibility. So suddenly to have this thing thrust upon her that's becomes like the pinnacle of aviation, the pinnacle of science and exploration. And then, of course, for it to inevitably lead to huge risk, personal risk and huge fear, a huge sense of fraud and pretense, which of course takes away from the pure enjoyment and the pure satisfaction of achieving those goals of not only becoming an astronaut, but then getting to go to the moon. So yeah, it was fascinating to play and a wonderful opportunity to explore, like you said, playing many different versions of yourself depending on the context. I think it all comes to some of my favorite scenes, unsurprisingly, were where the two worlds really meet with Krys Bauer in the Command Service module, where she sort of tries to marry them, and we see the really not great consequence of that. So yeah, it was an amazing thing to have to play.
Hopefully there is a hopeful version of reminding everybody we can be better than we are right now. And on that note, it was sure lovely talking with all you guys. We have to wrap it up, but thanks for chatting, and it was lovely to see your faces.
You want to explain what the hell's going on back there? I couldn't do it anymore. Just stay in that room. I didn't sign up for this, Ed.
I think maybe you need to call Houston.
We got a medical situation. We got to power up the lifeboat. Look at me. Hey, it's me. Calm down. Everything's gonna be all right.
What's gonna happen to him?
I ain't gonna send him to the shrinks. His career's over. I tell you that. I'll never let him fly again.
You mean in space, right?
I mean in anything.
Are you there?
Karen?
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm one of the creators and executive producers of For All Mankind. I'm here with Joel Kinnaman, Shantel VanSanten, Krys Marshall, and Michael Dorman. And we are here to talk about episodes 7 and 8 of For All Mankind, two of my favorites. And they were directed by the wonderfully talented Mira Manan. I should give her credit for that. And let's jump in. I think one of the first things, I thought about was what we've been going through these last few months with the quarantine and the COVID and being stuck at home and isolated. It did remind me a little bit of Hi Bob, episode 7, and the experience of the three of you of Apollo 22 being stranded together up on Jamestown. And I wonder if you guys going through this experience at home, if it's brought back memories or nightmares of that experience. Working together in that little space for those 2 weeks.
It's been crazy. Yeah. I mean, our experience on the show was very similar to our experience, off camera. When we began Hi Bob, I knew Joel and Michael, of course, but we had not spent that much time, really close-knit intimately the way that we did in those few weeks of shooting. So, I mean, Mira is just an amazing director, and the way in which she worked with us in the space really helped us translate our experience of working on the episode and bringing that into, the story. In real life, I mean, I went from thinking these guys are very great to feeling like they were totally obnoxious to then in the end feeling like these guys are like family. I mean, there are times when we were actually lying in these bunk beds, ragging each other, pulling each other's legs and, having a good time. And yeah, I feel like we got to know each other really, quick, fast.
We were definitely a quarantine during those 2 weeks.
Yeah. And it was such a blessing because then we didn't have to fake it. We didn't have to do any acting. It was just like we actually got to spend that time together. And it was lovely and exhausting and powerful all at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of, it shows in the episode, the camaraderie you guys have, I mean, does come through for sure when you're watching it.
It was fun. It was like, being in isolation and having time and being stressed and then having so much time that you're thinking and overthinking everything, and then playing a character that in that moment was forced to try and find a focus to sort of hide from, their mental breakdown. And listening to Bob Newhart on loop sort of helped to get me into that space where I felt like I was sort of going a little bit loopy because I'm listening to it again and again and again.
You got into that space.
And then, and then, isolate yourself, and then, everything that comes with that, it was, it was a roller coaster, but what a beautiful part of storytelling in terms of human condition and the way that we're so vulnerable and we can fracture when we're under pressure. It was really, really special story to tell.
I also thought it was so powerful how each of us sort of found our own way of almost like exaggerated qualities in ourselves during that isolation period. Joel, I saw you take Ed in a direction of much more stringent and kind of like, I experienced it, but I'd love to, hear you talk more about how Ed shifted because it was more overt with Gordo.
Yeah, I mean, I love playing that side because all of a sudden it became about, making a choice. Are you going to support your brother, or are you going to really take responsibility for this whole mission? And, and he's trying to juggle those two things that are both, incredibly strong in him. And then it comes to a point where he realizes that, to do one, he has to do the other. He has to, for Gordo's own sake, send him home. And, that was, I love this, I love the way that the friendship between Ed and Gordo has played through the show, and how they take care of each other and how they lean on each other. And and that, everything came crashing down in that episode.
How did you prepare for this, I guess? How did you look at this episode and kind of Gordo's journey down this hole, if you will?
I always look at it like, if you were to bring back Mira, you're sort of in there as the vessel pitching something, and then you've got outside eyes that are monitoring everything that you're doing so they can help you with increments. And it was sort of like a dialogue between us where I was like, we can't do too much. We don't want to show too early, but we want to do enough that if you were to go back and rewatch it, you'd see it happening. But on the first at a glance, you can't picture it. And so it was sort of finessing that in each moment. And I guess we were lucky that we were shooting sequentially, which always helps in an instance like this. We had the space, and it was pretty much us locked in that room for, a week or so.
Yeah, it was cool. It was cool to see you like find your way through that, it's always that thing. I think if you're playing a character that is depressed, or you're playing a character that is mentally ill or something, then that is the challenge that you sort of that you take on as an actor. Like, I'm going to play that, and then the challenge is to not overplay that and let it come out subtly, and it was cool to see how you did that, and especially after watching the episode, it was like it really like crept up on us as an audience. Mm-hmm. But I mean, for me, as Ed too, like seeing it slowly start to come apart, and to be in denial, and then some things were undeniable, but then you kind of push them away. Because the result of that would be so devastating. So you can't let that be the truth, and then you keep going. It was really fun to play that dance in a way.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of the inverse for Dani, where it's like, is she being hypersensitive? Is she being mothering? Is she being too nurturing? Is she seeing something that may not be there? And maybe he's having a tough time, but it may not be all that bad. So it's kind of lovely because the sort of invariable is Gordo. And then the observers are these two people who are on completely opposite sides of the fence. One who in many ways is totally blinded, and the other has got a magnifying glass to it. And so it's kind of lovely as it unfolds that, the audience is watching these three people and having a hard time figuring like, which way is up? Which one is got their finger on the pulse and which one's out to lunch? And then as we see, Danielle was right.
As a team, we collaborated on the floor as a team, and we were always there for each other. And it was a really great gift to be pitching something and have your peers sort of helping you craft something. Like, we all had input into moments. And it, like that, you have to create a lot of trust and a real safe space to be able to harness that kind of energy or that kind of space to make it work for you in a positive way. And that was just really cool. It was an absolute pleasure to be there with those guys, and for them to be watching everything and having their input too.
The issue of being stuck on the moon is there, but I think what's really these characters really struggling with is what's happening back on Earth. And that's what that's really what's messing with them. And I think in Gordo's case, even calling these walks out on the lunar surface apartment hunting, I mean, clearly the issues with Tracy and your marriage are, no matter how far you go, no matter you're on the moon, it's still there with you. It's still haunting you in a way, those demons. Yeah,
and I guess that's the idea of stress sort of manifesting, and like how stress manifests in having time. And a character like Gordo, he lives in the red line, so his way of breathing or coming back to some sort of equilibrium is adrenaline. And then to be stuck on the moon, and there's nowhere for him to find adrenaline. So he's basically starting to push himself in the suit as far as it will go to try and create some sort of amount of adrenaline to make him start to see clearly, or to help him deal with his stresses. And then he's got no control over there. He's stuck. So then without control, he can't even use that. So then he's doing things like throwing balls and, trying to just create movement or some sort of way of letting that out. And then you just watch him fall apart because there's nothing he can do. And each of them are different. Like even watching, Ed with the fitness, have a fitness machine or doing chin-ups or whatever, like, whatever he can do to sort of keep his mind straight.
Krys, let me ask you one question too about this decision that happens at the end of the episode where you decide, or Danielle decides to sacrifice herself for Gordo. I think, it's interesting because it's a complicated decision where I don't know if Danielle's fully aware of what the consequences will be when she comes back to Earth. And I'm curious what you thought about that decision going into it as a character and the ramifications of it.
I actually think that Danny is aware of the ramifications of what will happen when she comes back to Earth. And I think that's part of what makes it not a choice done in naivete, but a choice done in full knowledge and acceptance of what it will be seen as. I spoke a bit about this in our earlier discussion, but as a woman and as a Black woman, people will observe you and see you as a signifier for your entire gender and for your race each time you enter into a space. So she knows full well that she's not just a Danielle Poole, but she's sort of a representative for, an entire culture, an entire race of people. So she's got all that on her shoulders, and then sort of that's the macro. And then the micro is that she's got her own hopes and dreams of seeing out this experience to its fullest and being the very best and being the top of her class and, working her ass off to earn her position. So to put herself in that place where she's essentially throwing it all away for Gordo, I think is emblematic of how much she cares about Gordo, about how much she cares about this team, and about how sort of selfless she is. So I think what Danny does is equally extraordinary and also really ordinary for women everywhere.
I'm sitting back here as the silent observer fan of, first of all of y'all's work, because there was so much that didn't intersect. And Karen is truly quarantined in her life whenever Ed is away. And Ed is not the grand communicator. He's the grumbling, I think Karen has learned to read his moods. And more than anything, a really important part of being an astronaut's wife and part of the program is to know where he is mentally and be able to help him. Because at the end of the day, the mission is what matters. I sit back and I listen to everything that happened, and how I felt in real life is how Karen felt, where everybody had these episodes together or these moments together. And I'm like, well, I'm just over here all alone. So I don't get to have any inside jokes or, time with everybody. And, I would think, oh, that's how Karen feels. Like, yes, she has some of the wives, but, how often do they actually get together? How often do they actually connect and talk when they're running households, mowing lawns, taking care of kids, making sure everything is running smoothly? But that's a sacrifice she knew that she signed up for and gladly and lovingly does because she supports that.
The question I have is that decision you had to make, that painful decision of not telling him what's happening, is something that I know in the writer's room we were really arguing about ourselves. And I feel like it's not an easy decision. I'm sure different people feel different ways about it, but you felt it was the right one. And I'm curious what went into that. What happened with Shane in that you see at the end of episode 7, and in 8, we find out that he's in critical condition, and Karen, his mom, decides not to tell Ed, who's up in Jamestown, about what's going on with him and his condition.
I have to say it's interesting because I never questioned the reasoning why she wouldn't tell him. Maybe I had a little bit of a reservation, but I think I understood all along why, because at the end of the day, Karen is not thinking that Shane is going to die. That's a non-option. Her brain's not going there because at the end of the day, I think that Karen doesn't assume that Shane's going to pass away and doesn't assume how bad it is. So therefore, why worry him and stress him out even more? I can just tell him once it's all done and over with and I have it handled, like most of the things in their life. The hardest part for me was we didn't shoot in sequential order. So to build to a place of slowly chipping away at the reality and the tight grip that she has on hope was so hard for me to try to navigate. I mean, we were stuck in that hospital for 4 days straight, but we shot, the scenes in very different order. And there were some scenes that we didn't see.
And, moments that I tried to build this slowly breaking away of her grasp on hope. And Karen already struggles with control issues, and I understand why, because nothing in her life is predictable or controllable. And to me, that's like the overall theme of her journey in season 1 is trying to grasp onto the past because she knows it, she feels comfortable with it, she doesn't want things to change. Even from women being in space, which she was hesitant and resistant towards, to, okay, fine, I'll accept that, but I'm not going to accept this. And finally, her world comes crashing down, and she has to learn that she has zero control over anything, and the tighter she holds, the more she loses. And that, I think, comes in a lot of forms in her life. I know some people don't agree with what Karen did. And she has that moment with Tracy in the car where she's like, did I do something unforgivable? And Tracy's like, you did what you had to do. And I think each
love that
really
moment.
Different. Yeah. Like she did what she thought was best for Ed.
Yeah.
And the mission. And that's what their family was focused around.
And you feel that. I mean, I think for people early on in the season that weren't on Karen's side, by this episode, everyone was
wasn't on Karen's side.
No, you were questioning. I remember you were very like, what's her, I don't understand her. And by the end, you were fiercely defensive of her. And it shows. I mean, your embrace of her, I think, is what really made that character shine. All right. Thank you, guys. That was great. I think we should end with a hi, Bob, I think. So a bye, Bob, actually. So bye,
Bob.
Bye, Bob.
Bye, Bob.
Bye, Bob.
Security's really high. Look at that. There's a whole carrier task force out there.
It just doesn't seem very safe. What if it explodes in the atmosphere?
That's why we're launching it from the middle of nowhere, Karen.
Look, it's risky, Ed. This isn't just another payload. That thing's carrying plutonium.
Sea Dragon ignition sequence. Start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
Hi, Ron Moore again, here to welcome you to our third panel looking ahead at season 2. And I'm joined by more of our cast today with Joel Kinnaman, Shantel VanSanten, Michael Dorman, Sarah Jones, and Wrenn Schmidt. So like I said, we're going to tease season 2. And at the end of this, we're going to have sort of an exclusive sneak preview ahead with some footage that no one has seen of season 2 yet. Just to sort of set the stage, at the end of season 1, if you stuck around at the end of the finale and watched the after credit sequence, you saw the Sea Dragon clip that we put together, which jumped the show into 1983. So that's where we pick up. We pick up in 1983. Ronald Reagan is president. The Cold War with the Soviet Union has gotten very hot. And the sort of superpower competition between the Soviets and the United States has expanded into the realm of space. So the world continues to change. And the way we sort of played the 80s is you're definitely going to hear some 80s music and you're going to see some 80s fashion, but we try not to get too crazy with it. It's not, it's not sort of just hitting every cliche of the period over the head. We really did try to sort of take a realistic look at how things could have advanced and could have changed in this fashion. So now what I'd like to do is we'll kind of go through each one of the cast members and talk a little bit about their characters and sort of tell us, as much as you can without getting too specific about sort of where we pick up your character, 10 years later. And why don't we start with you, Joel?
We come in when we, 10 years after Shane died, and Ed has made some big sacrifices to his career. So he has chosen a path where the most important thing is his family. Last time his family went through an incredibly traumatic event, he was not there. And then the journey over the second season for Ed is about him and Karen figuring out a way to make the sacrifices that need to be made, but still be happy, and finding what sacrifices that is. And will Ed be able to be happy if he doesn't continue to strive to go into space and to be an explorer?
Was it hard to step into the character 10 years later when you showed up? I mean, we'd given you guys, an idea that this was all coming clearly, over the course of season one.
Yeah.
But when you had to come in, jump your character ahead 10 years, what's that like as an actor to try to suddenly make a leap like that?
Yeah, it was really difficult because we're also playing, Ed and Karen has gone through the ultimate tragedy. They've lost a child, and that kind of trauma, of course, is going to be completely transformational for any person. But we're not showing them working through that trauma. We're jumping ahead 10 years past, and that was really difficult, I felt, because it's really difficult to play that you kind of have worked your way through it in some ways, and then that the sadness and the grief that still is, always present. But how do you show that it's always present when it's something that you've been working through for 10 years? It's not maybe as explosive as it would be during the first few years. And I just thought that, I thought the writing was very bold in terms of showing, showing that stage of the grieving process. But it was really difficult. It was difficult to connect with it when it was sort of distant, and then so it took a few episodes for us to, I was in desperate need of a cathartic moment in a way. I think I needed to have the experience of the character going through the grief, and I didn't really get that in the beginning because that's not the part of the story that we were telling. So that was difficult, and then I think it's going to be very interesting to watch because it's an angle that I think is not so common to be shown.
Okay, great. Shantel, let's continue that thought for a second. In your case, picking up your character 10 years later, was it harder than season one? Because over the course of season one, it felt like we truly took you on quite an arc from beginning to the end, and you ended up in a very different place. And then we asked you to pick up yet another jump, instantly 10 years later. What was that like for you?
When I first met Karen, there was a lot I could say I didn't like about her because I didn't agree with her. And I struggled through starting very quickly from finding out, you have the role to playing the role, to finding places to try to understand her and empathize. And then I fell in love with who and what she stood for and where it came from. And I understood her better. And then you guys took me on a crazy journey and dismantled everything that there was that I had built for Karen, and, where all of her control came from and all the fear that she felt, and her entire world fell apart. And, the loss of a child was a giant to carry. And I couldn't imagine it. And to carry this story that one of our writers who wrote it, Nicole, it mirrors part of her life. It felt like a really big responsibility. So when we ended the season, I remember talking to Ben and Matt and you and being like, where does she go from here? Like, who's she going to be if she is not Shane's mother? Because that is like one of the most proud roles in her life and what she lives and breathes for. So it felt like I was lost and anxious during our downtime to hear where we would be picking up. And, it was like this blank slate. And I was shocked when I read the first few episodes. And I can't say that it was an easy transition. It felt jarring. And the first thing I did was take to my journal And I started creating memories and experiences and just writing like, okay, if this is where I'm at, what happened in between? And I have like a 200-page journal of just memories for Ed and Karen and their family and for Karen. And I think her learning that she can't hold on so tight and that nothing is in her control allows us to see a very different side of Karen when we find her, but also the ways that she's coping with, because she is type A.
Michael, what was it like for you? Now, your character took a very different journey than everyone else. And actually, all the journeys are pretty individual. But what was it like for you to have to step into this? Was there any particular challenge to pick this character up 10 years later?
I thought it was really great. There was so much to go on. When we leave Gordo, he's lost his mind or touch with reality, and he is living a lie. And then when we pick it up, he's kind of lost hope. And when you lose hope, you lose love for yourself, and you can't love anyone else. And then as the story takes on, it's a beautiful story about him being forced to look at the truth in himself and the choices that he's made to put him where he is. And we get to see it throughout the season. It's actually really, really beautiful.
Cool. Sarah, what about you? Was this harder to pick her up 10 years later than it was to carry her through the arc of season 1, or what do you think?
Yes, I think Tracy's in a very different place than she was when we left off, and when we pick it back up, she's a bona fide celebrity, and in a way that I think, it's a double-edged sword. I think on one hand, there's a feeling of validation to what she's doing and that she really worked her way to be where she is. And on the other hand, it's not at all what being a part of the program is, the NASA program is about. On top of that, she and Gordo have gone through a major transition. And I think Tracy's journey allowed her to sort of understand where Gordo had been at the beginning of their marriage. And she also has to find her way back. I think that's sort of a common theme in season 2 with the Stevens, with Gordo and Tracy, is that they had to sort of find their way back to whatever place feels like their most authentic selves, and getting lost a bit in both the responsibility and privilege of being such a public national figure, and what they represent. So yeah, I think there were definitely moments where I just thought, oh God, Tracy, you are just a nightmare right now. But then you have to figure out, of course, where you can find the sympathy and the empathy on why someone's behaving that way. And I think for Tracy, she just, I think the two common threads of season 1 and season 2 with Tracy is that search for validation, and ultimately having to find that for herself. And she realizes, I think in season 2 that it doesn't need to come from other people. It's important to find that for herself.
Wrenn, I'm really curious what you thought of this, because in a lot of ways your character is so internal and so complex and complicated, but there's very little outside sort of parameters about the change of Margot overall. Like even in season 1, she went through this whole arc of things, but she's such a tightly contained and focused character. When you had to pick up this character 10 years later, what's the process you go through to do something like that?
I feel like the stuff that I was really trying to focus on was, what is different in her world. And, so much of season 1 for Margot was fighting this uphill battle to be taken seriously and to be measured by the same, measuring stick that any person would, rather than, being measured by her gender, or measured in the shadow of Von Braun. And so Margot, I feel like in the first season just has so many obstacles, and, I feel like I kind of knew what to do with that. And this season it was a whole new ball of wax because, she's the captain of a very large ship, now that NASA has so many, missions, there's, exploration going on, collaboration with the military. There's just a lot. I mean, even just looking at this spreadsheet that Bradley shared with me that just showed everything that's going on at any given time. It was really interesting to look at Margot from more of a perspective of, well, she's got a lot of influence in kind of what's being done to advance science and research, and that's all super exciting. But she's also got this other piece now that is maybe a little bit more of a thorn in her side, which is the administrative part of her job. And so I feel like those were the things that I kind of really like dialed in on. And just, I don't know. And like the comfort and discomfort of being a boss, the comfort and discomfort of having to make tough calls, of having to disappoint people, of, kind of, I don't know, going against maybe her own internal compass, which is, this is the purpose of why we do this. Yet there are all of these other things that now have to happen, and, how she balances all of that. And then just finding like the comedy of it. I feel like that was also really fun. What is it to be the boss, but to still also be Margot? So I don't know. I feel like that was kind of my starting point. And then I have to say, there's also just like Margot's amazing glasses and her even more amazing hair this season. It was kind of like, wow, I definitely feel like a totally different person. Yeah. So I feel like that's kind of where I started. I tried not to get too bogged down and just the headiness of like, because I don't know. I mean, I don't feel that different from who I was 10 years ago. I think mentally, like who I was 10 years ago, that's how I still view myself. I'm like, I'm still fun. I'm still cool. I'm not going to say all that. You know what I mean? So yeah, that was my starting point, but it did feel tough. It was a different ball of wax.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you all at home for watching the panel. It's been great doing this. We're going to show you, like I said, a sneak peek of season 2. And after that, remember, you can binge all of season 1 and the extras on Apple TV Plus anytime it strikes your fancy. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
See you guys.
I can see what's coming.
Let me state as plainly as I can. The greatest threat the United States faces is posed by the Soviet Union. History has asked much of the Americans of our time. Much we have already given. Much more we must be prepared to give. We must maintain peace through strength as long as necessary.
Recommend go to DEFCON 3. Once we do this thing, there's no going back.